Hello everybody, welcome to the first InterFAB Expert Talk here online today. As you know, this InterFAB Expert Talk is a series of expert talks we will conduct together with all the other FABs over the next month. So we will address several issues which are basic for the performance of ATM. My name is Roland Behran and I'm happy to welcome you here. And I have to say I'm a little bit proud because we have about 230 people who have registered today. So I'm very happy to have you here and I'm very keen to get your feedback on the presentation we will have today. To facilitate this discussion, we will have a chat function to gather your questions to the presentation. So please feel free and use it intensively. The chat function, and we will use it then for the discussion. In detail, the planning is that we will have in the beginning a presentation about 20 to 30 minutes, and afterwards we will have 30 minutes of discussion, so feel free to put all the questions you have on the table. Coming to today's topic, the topic is the accuracy of air traffic forecast causes and consequences. And I'm very, very happy to have here online Professor Dr. Fricke. He is coming from the University of Dresden and is there at the Institute of Logistics and Aviation and chair of the Air Transport Technology and Logistics. Most of you might know him or know him from sure because Mr. Fricke already supported us twice. First, he did the keynote on the fragmentation research workshop in Budapest, and secondly, he was the final panelist for the conclusive panel of the interdependencies workshop in Rome, which was of course not in Rome, it was a virtual one, as you know. So I'm very happy that he's here, and I don't want to talk too much because you are not interested in my opinion, you are interested in the expertise from Professor Fricke. Mr. Fricke, please take over.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction, Roland. I'm very honored to give this first speech in that series of expert talks, as you called it. It is about accuracy of air traffic forecasts, and I have a five-fold story for the next 30 minutes to come. I want to just start with giving a very brief reflection on the needs of the forecast, explaining what actually is done by the Performance Review Committee, looking back on the STATFOR forecast and then giving some way forward ideas we see here in Dresden how things could be improved to probably better serve your ANSP needs. So what is the need for a forecast? Basically speaking, it's about trying to catch up ideally with the expected demand, so to say the number of flights over a traffic zone, an ANSP or country, with the required number of resources, human resources, that's basically the air traffic controller. If you assume that on average we need 5 years to get the controller online at a screen, so we need at least a forecast of 5 years. So that is the first step. And second, we think about what would be the effects if we do a bad job in forecasting the traffic demand. Then we could go either in the underestimation part where we say we had predicted too few aircraft, and that would lead to capacity erosions and aspects like delays in the air transport system. And if we would predict too many flights, then of course we would have an extra share of controllers. That means we would be costly ineffective. So the interest is of course to hit the point, but that's true for all forecasts, that's tricky. So a very brief look on how traffic forecasts are being actually built. First of all, this is a community around Eurocontrol forecast services, which takes the name STATFOR. And STATFOR has run since 1990, so more than 35 years now, and is doing that job in predicting air transport, so flights and service unit costs as well. So this is done on different time frames. So we start from a short term, 2 years, which is mainly done for the service units forecast, and then the medium term, which is very important for us. It covers a 7-year frame, and as I said, the 5 years then lays inside, which is required to do the good job for the prediction and the allocation of the right people to the predicted traffic. So on the right-hand side, you see typical input factors for that forecast. I think that is somehow normal to any type of forecast we're using in the mobility sector, or more generally speaking in the industry sector. The dark blue bubbles might be of specific interest. It's economic growth, which is also included in any of known forecasts. So there's always some assumed correlation between the welfare, the market power, and the intent to participate to mobility, which is a very fundamental parameter. Then we have, of course, a lot of political trends and maybe turning points which can result from let's say atmospheric, from war-oriented aspects. So we have a lot of disturbances on the system which should be considered. Most of them we know actually, which is COVID, which is and was the financial crisis in 2008. So all these kinds of artifacts which should be considered as far as we can. And then there's one point. This is a low-cost market which started 10 years ago, roughly maybe 50 now. And this was the coming into play of airlines such as Ryanair and at the early time EasyJet that really changed a lot the correlation between expected passengers and the number of flights to be used to transport all these passengers. So in very brief, STATFOR looked on that bubble set and then decided to create these types of forecasts. And what should be maybe taken on board as a first consideration is that STATFOR was not intending to really trying to hit for every forecast precisely the reality, but STATFOR was starting and working 2 times per year. At least this is what is actually going on, and history was a little different. So that we have 2 forecasts per year, a spring and an autumn report. And over the years, and we can assume that we have many, many reports being produced over the time frame, spring and autumn, year by year. And of course, then distinguishing into the different countries, and for the different countries, then pair rebuild onto the different ANSPs. So after all, hundreds of forecasts are being generated. And statistically, what they try to show is that over large series, we can do, this is their view, we can do better than a very simple linear extrapolation of the last year's growth or descent. This is the first intent. And second, statistically, to be on average better than a given confidence interval, which I'm going to introduce now on the next slide. Before doing so, allow me to just bring you back a little bit to school and to give you an idea of how the whole system works. I think that's important to recall because it's a little tricky. So let's assume we are in the year 2015 and look back on 2014 and see that we had a growth of 2%. Then the team from STATFOR would work on and generate the forecast from 2014 to 2019, so covering 5 years. Actually, they do 7 years, but let's say that's interesting for us here for the question of concern. And they would predict a 3.9% forecast. So that would be trying to compare it with what I call the naive approach. So that's just simple extrapolation of the last year's growth over the years to come, and that would show the dotted line. In reality, of course, things always change and get a little different. So in reality, we might have 3.2% growth rate for these 5 years. So what would be the first activity? We try to figure out how accurate we were for this so-called base scenario. So the highest line, the STATFOR baseline, is only 1 out of 3 scenarios which are always being created. And for this one, I'm just talking for the moment. So a lot of parameters no show up, but don't get scared. It's not about too much mathematics. It's just to show you what has been done. The first arrow is finally the difference between STATFOR forecast and reality. So this is a 0.7 or 0.7 overestimation from the perspective of STATFOR, right? Then if you take the absolute arrow, then this is just a positive value to typically aggregate values over time series. It might be useful to use absolute values, not to lose too much data, because you would have a compensation between plus and minus values. So then, second, very important step is we do the same story for the naive approach and see that the difference between the 3.2 real flights observations compared to the naive approach 2.0 is a difference of 1.2. Okay, so and if you then build the ratio between the first and the second one, then we divide simply the 1.2% by the 0.7%, and that's the accuracy, or what they call also the relative performance, and it comes to 1.7. By the way, STATFOR says everything which is above 1.5 is considered to be a good work. So they did, on their view, a better work than just sticking to the naive approach. Let's go on and inject what they did also, and what is the typical approach for forecast is to build around the base scenario high expectancies and low expectancies. These are the 2 second and third high blue lines here on the upper part of the screen. And then there's a question of how do we build that high and low scenario, and that's a little tricky, as I was just introducing in the beginning. There's a name for it, and the aim is to build a confidence interval. They call it a CI, and the CI is such that they hope that 50% of all observations would lie within the high and the low base scenario. So it's a little result-driven strategy in using a CI which at the end delivers that every second observation should lie inside this, if you like, it's this tunnel between the high and the low scenario. Shown on the right-hand side now, you see that CI value here. We can conclude at the very final point and say, if ever we would now analyze all these observations gathered for this 5-year period, and then we would come to probably the intention, say, okay, only 30% were lying inside that CI value, so not the 50% we were hoping for, then the so-called risk is just a difference. So it's 20% more forecast laying outside compared to what we wanted. That is a final step to get you on that point here. They build the so-called overall performance, that's called KPI, and this is a combination of that base or point estimate for the accuracy and the ranging perspective on the CI, and this is just the subtraction of the relative performance minus that risk value, and this would lead for this little example of 1.7 minus 0.2 to 1.5. So that is the value that is at the end the performance estimation, and there is target setting active, and actually, as I was introducing, STATFOR says everything which is for the RP value above 1.5 is a good estimate, and for the target, since the RI value can vary between minus and plus 0.5, we come to 2.0. That was the school time, so be relaxed. We go back to reality, and we try ask ourselves now, having known this, what does it tell us for the forecast outcome? Since the forecast is the flights per period, per year, and per traffic zone, which can be a country, first instance, then we would have that tunnel on the right upper side. So you see again the low and the high scenarios and the base scenarios. You see a confidence interval value. And this is now exactly taken from the spring report 2019. So we are much more now in reality compared to the previous slide, which was more on the last part. And then we can exactly compute what does it tell us. And it tells us we have a difference in 13.2% between the low and the high scenario for the next 5 years to come. So prospectively speaking, from 2019, looking forward to 2023. So if you would convert these 13.2%, we would end up to something slightly below 500,000 flights uncertainty. So what is to be expected over Germany over next year between low and high performance scenario? So it's roughly 500,000 flights. So that is obviously quite a lot. So you might ask, so why not changing the CI value to make it narrow, to go from 50 to 30% or to 80% to largen it up? So there are many options to discuss on it. As I said, actually STATFOR says this is not a mathematical logic behind, it's just an aim to make a user satisfying solution. So you must now decide if that is satisfactory, yes or no. But that was the intent, to set the CI to 50%. So if we look actually on what is going on with the CI effectively resulting confidence or percentage points, we look on the lower right graph here. And the lower right graph tells you, okay, I can see immediately that over the years, now looking from 2006 to 2019, the CI interval in terms of percentage points, so the absolute values between low and high scenario, are varying quite a lot. So we have massive changes, and that means we have massive variations or fluctuations in the number of flights which can happen or may not happen. So reasons are manifold, and as you may expect, you can assume that, again, we have turning points, we have effects like crisis and issues that might reside in different confidence intervals, yeah, in terms of percentage points. So that's somehow natural. However, it makes clear that technically speaking, from year to year, you may expect that your certainty is changing, and quite tremendously. And this, of course, may have consequences for the air navigation service providers in correct staffing for the next 5 years to come. So what we did is, now we go forward with our analysis of the STATFOR data and ask ourselves if we would then use the confidence interval parameters, so the exact numbers of flights. We converted the country representation, so I was starting with Germany, into something which is trying to represent all Europe. So what we did is we had a conversion technique applied. I do not mention right now because it takes too much time, but it is just to convert the country reference data into ANSP specific data. We were using all the STATFOR spring reports, as mentioned, for the 5-year prediction period from 2019 to 23. So everything you now see on the next graphs to show is for the year 2023. And so what we can see is that we have on the right graph a uncertainty of roughly, as you can see, 788,000 flights laying within the low and the high performance scenario. This is true for FABEC, and you can go all the way down to colleagues like the Baltic FAB, which is still holding values of 160,000 flights. So this is huge, and on my understanding, and it is specifically very heterogeneous. So the left graphic show you, and this is true then for all the next coming slides, so then we can speed up a little bit on the graphics. So on the left-hand side, you see specific data per country. So that's the difference between left and side, country perspective, left side, FAB or ANSP perspective, right-hand side. So that is the first lessons learned. The CI induces relevant and non-homogeneous uncertainties for every traffic zone. If we go ahead now and try to correlate further the flight movements to required full-time equivalents of air traffic controllers, then we were using ACE data. Again, we used the same 5-year prediction. And at the end, what we can see is that these roughly 750,000 flights uncertainty results in a uncertainty in terms of air traffic controllers required to do the job of 733 for FABEC once again. And you see the same decreasing trend for the other FABs, but just to give you, again, the information that the conversion from flights to full-time equivalents results in basically a similar shape. And it is not about claiming specific issues for the FABEC. It's just giving you the interesting information, I do hope at least, that the values are quite diverse throughout the different FABs. And that is something which is, again, quite important. So do not forget about a very important simplification on our side. So this is a trend. This is not absolutely precise. Why? Because we were using a linear interdependencies between the flight numbers and the required flight air traffic controllers. And that is specific for each unit. as shown on the right-hand side. So it's not one factor for all, but it's a specific factor for each. But nonetheless, we do not consider things like economies of scale, for example. So if you have much more traffic, so probably you can be much more efficient with using your personnel to do the job. So that is not considered in the graphics. At the end, there is one step missing, and that is the cost part. So in millions of euros, we tried now to convert the required ADCOs in money. And that is, again, a similar graph. So as introduced, I can speed up a bit. So you see a similar behavior on the right-hand side regarding the different graphs. So with a more than linear decrease from left to the right. Yeah. And you see on the left graph that we have, again, the CI-related ATC employment costs varying, again, massively, because we have values here. You can see the dark figures, for example, for Portugal, 55 converted or compared to values which range below 1 for the upper north of Europe. So you see also from that perspective, we have large heterogeneity in a system, even though we are using all the same scales and metric to, let's say, estimate the performance of the forecast. Yeah. So that's for that series of analysis based on the status quo information. And then let's move on to the next, which considers in things like lessons learned. So what we can conclude is mainly said, we tried now to recompute the CI to investigate compared to all of the observations and see whether the 50% intent of STATFOR at the time being has been reached, yes or no. And as I said, it was just the intent to create manageable, so risk manageable scenarios, which are mainly true and fewly wrong. But what we can show at the end is what you see on the lower graph. When again we take all the spring reports and look from 2011 to 2018-19, then we see that the shares of the air navigation service providers which lay inside the CI is quite diverse, and that after all, the overall performance is only 39%. So we did not hit the 50%, and so according to the standard definition coming from STATFOR, we holding a risk of, technically speaking, 11%. So 11% more observations led outside the confidence interval as, let's say, expected or hoped for. So again, the right-hand graphics show the variances between the different countries, but on my understanding, we can go back later on in a Q&A session. First of all, I guess this is what you can take on board. So with the current setting of the CI, we do not catch up with the intent of delivering every second forecast to be true. So if we go for the next idea, so what did we learn about that here in Dresden? So first of all, we come to a very simplistic conclusion, which says, and basically we could say, let's enlarge the CI, so to increase the number of forecasts which lay inside the tunnel. That would, of course, increase uncertainty, which is not in the interest of the STATFOR philosophy. So I guess that's not a solution. Yeah. The second part is that we, of course, we are doubtful about this comparison to the naive forecast. Of course, that is a, yeah, let's say by intent in thinking, which might be interesting to say, at least better than the do nothing situation. But actually, if we then link in the single European sky performance scheme methodology, where we have to deliver performance data for each of the ANSPs, for all of the listeners here, then we could see probably we should get away from this naive approach and really make absolute comparisons to actual traffic. And this is what we tried for you. And how did we do this? By just introducing a very popular, we can say, statistical value, which is called the mean average percentage error. So you see on the right-hand side how it's defined. It's much easier than what I was showing you for the RP and the risk and the KPI. It's basically saying the actual values compared to the prediction and divided by the actual value. Yeah, so this is the absolute figures. That's how you can find it in the textbooks for the mathematics and statistics. And at the end, that would allow us to aggregate over all of the forecasts to a MAPI value, which takes its name then. And if you would try to convert it to STATFOR language, then we would build 1 minus MAPI to get to the accuracy. So it means low MAPI values means high accuracy, and high MAPI values means low accuracy. So if we apply just that simple logic, then we can see what comes out. A second point might be interesting to notice is that we further would assume that there is no linear dependencies between delay and cost ineffectiveness. So the chance to get wrong with my forecast would result in non-linear effects on the outcome side. That is the only statement for here. So that should also be taken into consideration when interpreting the MAPI. But let me just allow to give one more point, and that is that the MAPI also holds somehow standardized quality indexes, so numbers which are considered to be okay or not okay. And you see the 5 and 10%, and here in a right-hand scale, what is meant by this. So if we would try to further distinguish into the over and underestimation, because that seems to be very critical for the system, cost effectiveness versus delay, then we just skip the absolute parameters for the MAPI, call it MAPI directed, and introducing positive and negative values. And that is what you see here in the extended table on the lower right side of the graph, and hopefully you can just see that, okay, by just skipping that absolute parameter, I can get a minus and plus values. That's the only slight difference. And if we do this, what comes out for you to know, quite interestingly, that we can say the MAPI score says differently to the RP, which is quite promising for the outcome of the last years, to say, that we have quite a poor prediction quality for 22 out of 36 ANSPs. We have a very good value, so one below 5%, only for one ANSP. And overall, we can also say that if doing so, and you look on the right-hand side here, you see that again, we have a nice distinction capability with the MAPI to show where the system runs well and where it does not. So that is, let's say that the scaling between low and max values are quite important. So this is something which might be interesting to learn about the outcome of the MAPI, because at the end, what we want is not to invent new scores only, but we want to give the right injections into what should be done with the forecast techniques from now on. So that's the idea. So if you use the directed MAPI, just last small point about over and under estimations. So we can see if you do it for long bunch of forecasts. So we were using 8 years for all the 34 ANSPs. We come to more than 270 observations along these 8 years. And we can say we had all over and many underestimations. That's exactly the effect what we could learn from the CI failure, right? When using the STATFOR technique. But interestingly also is that what you see on the low part is that in the past, we had rather overestimation. So the blue boxes here, the blue bars are more dominant, whereas for the more recent years, we have the greeners getting more and more dominant. So what tell it me? So we have overestimation in the past and probably underestimation rather in the more recent years. So that is something which should also be considered. So at the end, we make a very last point for the data analysis and saying, okay, once we know this, what is for a point estimate? And we were using the data of 2018. I'm trying to look where is the MAPI value with regard to specific ANSPs and what does it tell us? And so what we introduce here is a two-dimensional diagram where you see that new directed MAPI value on the X scale. And you see the average delay values, which may be contributed to ANSP performance, which holds this famous abbreviation CRSTMP. And these correlations are shown here for some deterministic data points like Deutsche Flugsicherung, like DSNA, DGAC, and so on. So you have these data, and what we can see is that we can support the estimate that if ever we do over or underestimations, the correlation is non-linear, but delay increases exponentially with demand, which is also following typically queuing theories in mathematics and statistics. So that is the thesis. Coming on, then the delay growth results in increasing underestimation. So the saturation may, however, follow different slopes. And these are shown on the right hand just for sketchy information. So the idea here is to show if ever we weigh in over and underestimations, we should not, as already stated, remain on a linear model, but we require a higher order model to do so. And the queuing theory may deliver us good, let's say, blue scales for doing so. Yeah, so this is what we still are actually doing. The work in progress is to apply regression analysis between these different parameters like delay and standard saturation for a given ANSP, then the MAPI directed, and to see what is the outcome on the delay side and on the cost ineffectiveness side. So to wrap up, what we learned is there's a relevant spread between high and low. We must even extend that spread in order to catch the expectation from STATFOR. The time horizon is crucial, so we must be clear that we're using always data which are 60 months ahead of us, and that should be also considered if ever we're changing the forecast horizon. We have shown that at least there is good chance to also bring in other performance and quality indicators in the discussion. We're just presenting here the MAPI, which may not be the only candidate, but just for here, interesting to talk. And there is one final message I would like to draw to your attention. We were thinking about the effects now for the coming years. And as we all know, we're starting route from the COVID downturn into next decade, which might be crucial for all of us taking part to the ATM system, that we should think about introducing a new parameter, a new area which is already existing for the performance scheme, but which is not yet being used on the STATFOR side, and this is what I call ecology. So we should really, in addition to capacity or delay and cost ineffectiveness, we should go for ecology. And so my idea was, together with my team here, to think about introducing a fuel consumption assessment system, which is being simply linked to STATFOR prediction and then delivers one additional value. And it means for a given ANSP, you do not get only the number of flights, but you also the intended planned fuel consumption. And relying on that planned fuel consumption, you get all the emissions being produced as expected. So that would consist of your extended STATFOR scenario. We have a candidate system which already runs at EFS, so the ITER system could exactly do that job for this activity. And so in brief, we could be confident that we could deliver these data to any STATFOR forecast you want to use. A look behind the scenes, it's nothing but a typical aircraft performance modeling system, which uses the aircraft motion data, which would be the flight plan data created from the STATFOR system. At the beginning, we were using standardized weather data and aircraft applications and airframe engine combinations, and then we let compute all the stuff. And at the end, and this is the only mission you should take award, is we're gonna engine emissions model. We get the data which is verified both on the APM side through the BADA, the base of aircraft data coming from Eurocontrol, basically from Boeing and Airbus, and we're gonna use the ICAO emissions database to really convert into emissions. So this brings me to my last slide. So if you would do so, we could just think about saying we could do something like a twofold run. First, we could use that extended data to enrich the STATFOR forecast. And once the forecast is done, we could go in the performance evaluation mode, which is shown on the lower part on the screen, where instead of using the traffic forecast here, then you would skip to real data like ADSB or radar data, and we would use that radar data to compare the planned consumptions and emissions with the real ones and see what is the effect in that level, and that could perfectly be brought into the MAPI score in order to deliver an additional information aside, let's say, staff costs. We could also go ahead with, let's say, environmental costs. And I think this is something that could be very valuable for the, let's say, renaissance and for the social understanding and of our system to come, of the aviation and air transport system for the years to come. I think this is going to be a very crucial point for acceptance in the global thinking. So that was my last point for here. I already gave you a contact from DFS where you could talk to if you're interested in. And this is all I have to say at the moment. Thank you for listening and stay tuned for your questions and comments.
Thank you, Professor Fricke, for this comprehensive presentation. I really think there was a lot of content inside and a lot of interesting points. Maybe just before I go to the first question, which I would like to raise, just a brief hint. We will publish, of course, the slides, and we will publish this stream so you can work on it later on. So, Mr. Fricke, first question from my side. You mentioned the gap between the low and the high scenario. And when I saw figures there concerning 12 flights after 5 years and the ETCOs which are used over Europe, talking about 3 million flights and about 2,900 ETCOs. Is a forecasting a reliable management tool for you? And what would help to improve this? Would it be the easiest way to shorten it, the prediction?
And basically, I would say any forecast we do is uncertain. That's the nature of it. So I don't want to blame anyone like Eurocontrol saying they're doing a good or bad job. That I guess it's inherent to the problem. What we definitely will need is still sticking at least with a plus 5 year period in order to get that, let's say, hiring and training concept realized. Of course, we need the update rates, which are okay on my view, with twice a year, which is good. The problem is at the end to get more insight of what is really being done inside the STATFOR forecast system. And this is, on my understanding at least, we spend little time on it, as not very clear. So we can only take it as something like a black box and then apply the performance measurement on it. And what we could show in that talk, hopefully, is that the performance is not as good as predicted. So there should be an improvement. And this should be talked with the STATFOR guys, what could be improved on the forecast side. And on the other side, I think we must be clear that only uncertain forecasts are certain outcomes. So the 50% value should not be exceeded. That is my clear statement. If you go for higher values, then we would absolutely lose any relevance of that forecast, and that brings too much uncertainty in the system.
Okay, thank you for this answer. Uncertainty, you mentioned the overestimations and the underestimations. From your perspective, what is the worst one? Is there a distinction between both, or how do you would you assess this aspect?
Yeah. First of all, I think it is very important to notice that air traffic control and management is totally different to all other mobilities systems in that sense that we always grant safety. So we have to say, whatever the number of unexpected growth is, we have rules in existing, and we will not bypass any rules. So there's always safety granted. However, what we can see if we go for overestimation, so it means we have less flights realistically flown than expected, then we have people sitting around, if you like. And this is a costly issue. So I think the overestimation is definitely something which is economically important. However, we must also be honest that we have to pay the system. And that's nothing which is comparable to an open market so far. So on my view, honestly speaking, I'm not an economist, but I would say that is not the big problem. The underestimation leads to too much traffic, crowded traffic. Since we stick on safety, we say, okay, we will never compromise safety with an underestimation. But what we will do is, with regard to my ideas presented on the last slides, we will compromise ecology. So we will definitely deliver poorer performance on fuel consumption since we fly holdings, we have delays on ground, and all this is costly and all this is emissions. So if you could have a look forward, my view, honestly is the underestimation is something which is getting crucial for the next years to come.
I have here a question, or it's not really a question, but I think it's fair enough from Eurocontrol, from David Marsh, telling us you several times that STATFOR induces uncertainty. It isn't the forecast that is uncertain, it's the future. A forecast tries to capture and understand some of that uncertainty. What would be your response?
Again, this is like a philosophical statement. What we need in order to say yes or no to that statement is what is the requirement for forecast is to have a robust set of input parameters and the output is clear. Yeah, we know what it is, so flights or full-time equivalents and service units. But what is not clear is, frankly speaking, is what is the input data set all over? And what is the mechanism used to combine, for example, the GDP with an increase in mobility demand? What is about the interpretation of the duration effects coming from turning points like the financial crisis in 2008 and now the COVID? That is brand new question. So will we expect with our next scenarios that this will last for 5 years or for 10 years? We need a very robust modeling to do this before we come up with a low and high band scenario, because I would expect from looking into the past that we would create very large, let's say, tunnels for the next forecast to come, since the future is specifically uncertain for the next 5 years with regard to hopefully the gearing up after COVID.
Thanks for the feedback. Maybe one point I would like to raise here and state very clear. Of course, these sessions are not meant to blame Eurocontrol or somebody else. That's not the point. It's the point, how can we do better? And we all know that things are changing in a way which we never have expected. Therefore, I really appreciated a second comment by David telling us that he's happy to look on MAP and to work in common. So I think that should be the way forward. Coming to the next question, there's Wilma from, I think, Lithuania, asking what recommendation could you provide to the STATFOR in order to improve the accuracy of the traffic forecast?
Yeah, what I was just at least sketching up with my slide, hopefully, is that we will continue working on the MAPI. We will try to incorporate regressions for the major correlation issues like delay and cost ineffectiveness. We would like to inject the ecology aspect and then deliver at the end per ANSP a very comprehensive statement or time series over the last 10 years, how precise that STATFOR forecast was with regard to the new metric developed and applied. But my, let's say, forecast on the forecast is that we will show that with the different metrics, that the STATFOR forecast will probably get a little lower score in quality. So it would say, if we want to use MAPI, then we will show that the quality was not that satisfactory compared to what comes out from the CI and the RP. So I guess what the question behind is, what would we then do with that knowledge? And that would clearly get back to the question of how the forecast is being built. And my very first wish and recommendation would be, we need something like a clear explanation handbook on how the forecast runs, how it works. And then we can go into a more detailed debate on what is an option for improvement, probably in order to get systems even better. Even though I'm fully convinced that this is the central interest and intent of the whole STATFOR team, but many people thinking probably a few more helping hands could be generated.
There's a question from Ralf Riedle, former chairman PRC and CEO DFS, asking, Is it correct to conclude that the introduction of ecology in the STATFOR system would improve the forecast for the ANSPs to achieve a better performance?
Yeah, what I think is if you would come to the delay figures, as I said, you have this tricky non-linearity between the delay produced and the underestimation of taking the shape I was showing you, this exponential behavior. So that's really tricky to really get precise. If we would deliver additional information with a STATFOR forecast, you would easily have another parameter which shows you, look, I have 5%, 6% less fuel consumed than expected, or more fuel consumed than expected. And if you get to the latter one, so if you have more fuel consumed compared to the base scenario, then we may expect that that is due to ATC instructions. Yeah, it may also be that there is slight differences in payloads and average masses of aircraft and so on. But I think the major effect will come from reroutings, from flight level allocation schemes and missing directs and things like that. So if things get crowded, we get less effective in terms of ecology. And so I could imagine that aside the temporal measurement of delay, that additional parameter could perfectly help tuning both the ANSP performance by itself, and of course, getting back to the STATFOR forecast for the next then iterations to come and see whether the assumptions are correctly made for these relevant and relevant parameters dealing with that saturation effect in the model. Hopefully I was clear.
Just to come to another point by Jenny Beechner from UK, she's looking on the traffic development prior 2020, so that we had a decrease of growth rates, and afterwards, prior to the pandemic, a traffic downturn. How can such developments like traffic disruptions, or now, as you know, there are political instruments like reducing internal flights, internal domestic flights. How can they be integrated in such a performance forecast system?
Honestly, if you look back for the 20 years nearly, from 2002 until now, if you look into the performance review report from Eurocontrol specifically for the year 2015, that was the most interesting on my view, you get 9 to 10 down or turning points listed. So what the STATFOR forecast claims for itself, it says, I already proved to work with such, let's say, abnormal situations or even disruptions in the system. So I think this is nothing new where the model should be confronted to. Of course, the pandemic now is a very tremendous effect. So let's see what comes out. But what I also can conclude from the historic part is that if ever you come into tricky times like we do actually, then by default, the confidence interval selected with 50% will at the end deliver higher discrepancies between lower and higher band scenario, so increase uncertainty. And that is what my expectation is. So we must be very specifically working on the setting of the CI boundaries for the next forecasts to come, not to really go into either too strong over or underestimations with the given effects. So that is the issue. And again, I would like to be more concrete towards a question, but the problem is without exactly knowing what is the modeling component inside to derive the low and the high band scenario, I can't give you a more detailed answer at this point.
There's another question by Pete Probst. I don't know where he's coming from. How do you predict the differences in charging per zone, as some traffic has shifted in the past years due to that? Do you have a recommendation on how to tackle this?
So this is fully outside of the scope what I just was presenting, but it's fully okay. Since what we did here in the research so far is only the input side. So we just we're looking on the flights to be delivered or managed, and then on the traffic controller resources requirements. This is tackling the service unit forecast issues, so where we just try to extrapolate for the next year to come how much money is being, let's say, collected with supervising the flights. There is, hard to say, there is a complex strategy change, since the RP values are also computed, so relative performance values are also computed for the service unit forecast, but with much higher quality. They say, first, since it's only a 2-year forecast, so that is by default a much more stabilized system. And second, it is narrowed down on the CRCO areas. So to give a good feedback on that question, I would say we need something like an aggregated view over the whole area, and then or draw back the conclusions for the different ANSPs at the end. So the same approach, basically what I presented here in my talk, to say we start from the European perspective and then breaking down to the different units. That should allow us to better consider bypass strategies, as you were mentioning. But again, also here, we need a more deeper insight in the STATFOR technique in order to build in probably a parameter which definitely would consider that effect between, I don't know, Portugal and flying over North Atlantic. These kind of very concrete applications could be considered in such a forecast, and that could effectively then make clear if things go wrong, why they did go wrong.
Just to add one information, PIT comes from Anna Luxemburg. There's one statement from Luis Barbero from GATCO, UK. Forecasts have limitations because they are just an educated guess. They cannot capture, predict highly disruptive, low probability events. As such, it is not about blaming Eurocontrol STATFOR, it's about the stakeholders taking that information with a pinch of salt and not to take that data at gospel. The hype around those forecasts and the amount of regulation, business decisions, financial decisions based on those forecasts is a real problem. A more balanced and sustainable approach is needed, using forecasts just as a support tool, but not as the basis of the decision making. And if I may add one point to the statement, if I understood the market tool correctly, you are translating there the pure figure of increasing or decreasing flights with other aspects. Would this be a way out to improve the decision-making in regulation due to the points that we would include there other parameters which are more on a qualitative aspect?
As for the statement, of course, I think that I can't just add a lot. I think again, we shouldn't mix up producing a forecast and then weighting the performance of that forecast. And the latter is what we did here. I think whatever you create as new type of forecast, it will always end up in unsatisfactory, simple cases. What we must come clear is that overall, we have a acceptable quality statement. And I think this was a good idea from STATFOR, saying we're trying to fit that confidence interval such that, but what we had to learn now is, again, quite simplistically, we do not match that expectation with a given technique, and it's getting more complex in the future. So we have to work on the model. And it is not really helpful to only go on the performance measurement side, what you were asking, Roland, saying, is a MAPI probably useful in adding qualitative parameters? Yes, we believe so. If not, we would not go for that research way. The question has not yet been answered. Let us give us probably 3 to 4 months more, and then we know it. But at the end, it's still only the quality judgment on a given product. And we must dig into the product.
Okay. Maybe one last question. We never can escape at the during these times. We have the pandemic. From your perspective, it might be a very personal statement. Does any forecasting at the time, for the time being, must make sense at all? Because nobody knows where we are going.
Yeah, I think that is indeed something which is obviously presented in every news broadcast story every day. I think it's all about vaccination strategy. It's about the testing strategy. I think the mutants are something which is in our daily ears, if you like. And after all, what I could now learn is that more and more society is realizing that we have to live with the virus, and that would probably even help the system in gaining better predictability. Because if we once would agree that there is no way out and no way without virus living in the next 10 years to come, then I think the forecast capabilities in getting good assumptions for the model behind are even increasing. So to conclude, what I think is whether or not we like it, specifically in Germany, we have a hot debate with the Ethics Commission. I think there will be something like a scaling factor along people that are vaccinated and those not yet gotten their vaccination. So I guess that's is something which should be included in the parametric system, and then we can expect that the system is getting back to line step by step. But it will certainly take another 5 years, so it's still coping with a full forecast by STATFOR to get back to where we were.
There's a final statement which I would like to read on. It's by Prof Fricke again. May I assume that there's no recipe how to adjust the stat forecast to give the Commission a good reason to reliably use for target setting? Adding risk factors and tools like ecology would make the forecast better, but are not the solution. I think from your perspective, would you subscribe, or are you cautious on this?
Yeah, I could follow that statement, briefly said, but indeed I'm a little bit not scared, but let's say sensitive about judging too much and too early on the way we should change the forecast. Yeah, because I was clear right at the beginning for that expert talk today that things may mix up easily. And again, the whole performance scheming apparatus with RP3 and RP4 behind, they are all looking on the outcome. And what we just care about is who is producing the reference lines and how is this done? And again, I think this is much more in the rear of the room, actually, and we have really to put it forward and to get more hot debates and even, let's say, emotional debates, because I believe that is easily becoming emotional because different countries are getting different effects on it. And this must be debated much more intensively than we had it in the past. And once this is overcome, I think people will also understand that at the end, the quality of the forecast will always remain limited. And with the parameters we have and with the propositions we did in terms of the MAPI and the ecology part, there is enough parameters and metrics to cope with all types of RP4 parameters, except the safety issue, but I think the safety issue is something which is not useful to be implemented on a forecast level. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Fricke, for all the statements and the answers. You absolutely rightly concluded that there's a thin line between politics and the way how university can work, do expert work. And this is really the crucial part. Therefore, I'm very happy that you took over this task today to provide us with your expertise on the subject, which is really, from my perspective at least, very relevant for the discussions in the future, because we can only improve the system if we have a sound basis. And what I take as a takeaway from this discussion is also based on the feedback provided by David from Eurocontrol, that there's a way ahead to go further, to bring the experts together, and we will take it on board. Thank you very much, Professor Fricke. Thank you to all the colleagues which have joined and which have contributed with their questions and their statements. As mentioned upfront, we will publish the presentation and we will publish the stream. And in addition, I would like to invite you to the next InterFAB Expert Talk. This will be about economic surplus and will take place on the 24th of March. So we will have a follow-up of several expert talks until the summer break. We are working on volatility, on climate change and other aspects, but we will keep you posted. So take care of yourself and enjoy the day, the rest of the day. Have a nice day. Bye.